Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming to the panel on statutes and regulations that remove barriers to infrastructure deployment. Know the rules. I'm Chris Toomey from the Law Office of Me, and I'm here with an all-star panel of it's lawyers except for one who was smart enough to escape the law. And we're going to go through sort of three different sets of opinions on how this is all playing out. Now, the first, Leslie's going to go first, and she's going to discuss some of sort of the background of how this all works. Steve has some slides on a couple other aspects. And then Elizabeth's going to talk about what the FCC is doing to potentially dismantle and/or help a lot of the underlying issues that you'll have heard about earlier. One thing I need to say, I haven't seen any pickets, but for those of you who are familiar, I've become sort of a social media scourge with a star with a nasty gram that's gone viral, inciting WISPA on WISP violence. So if you're interested in that, you can go next door where there's the friendly competition panel, because apparently I'm not very good at promoting that. Or you can talk to me afterwards. But let's let these guys speak because they got a lot of interesting things to say, and they're real smart people who can help you out. So with that, I'll introduce Leslie.
I'm Leslie Moylan, and I'm an attorney in the D.C. office of Davis Wright Tremaine. We are a full-service law firm that has, I can't even remember how many offices, but on the East and West Coast and all the way out to Shanghai. And my practice is I spend a lot of time on wireless infrastructure deployment issues in general, but specifically wireless infrastructure deployment. But I am new to the world of WISPs, so I've really enjoyed learning from all of you, and hopefully I can impart some of my knowledge as well here. I did put out some of these out on the tables, and I know we're not supposed to be like hawking our goods or services, but this is actually something that's free. I actually co-host a podcast, and this gives you the website where you can find it. And this actually, I'm not even sure if this is updated, but hopefully it directs you to it. And it's a wireless sighting podcast, which I'm sure you can imagine tops the charts for podcasts. But it started out where the first probably 9, 8 or 10 episodes walk through the process of submitting zoning applications at the local level and how you can build your record the best. And then it sort of devolved into talking about more current events and deployment in the public right-of-way. So hopefully that can be useful to some of you, and I welcome any feedback that you have about it and any ideas that you have for future episodes, or if you'd like to be a guest, that would be great too. So there it is. So first, talking about the ways that local governments regulate wireless facilities that you're trying to put up. And first I'm going to talk about traditional zoning regulation. And many of you may know this already or have already been through these processes. But the places where you should be looking for the ways that local governments regulate what you're putting up are first looking for the zoning codes and ordinances. Obviously, you're going to figure out what the particular area is zoned, and then the type of permit that is required for what it is that you want to put up. So there's specific requirements for specific zones. And then many local governments have specific wireless ordinances on top of the general permit requirements. And those are usually found like towards the end of county codes or city codes because they are more recently enacted, and sometimes they're called like the antenna ordinance or the wireless ordinance. And those have more specific requirements for applications. There's also different types of state environmental ordinances, and historic preservation regulations that can apply as well. So there are limits to how local governments can regulate wireless facilities, and one of those, and I'll talk at the end of this how these specific regulations may or may not apply, but the big one is Section 332 of the Federal Communications Act, and the citation for that is there, but it puts specific limits on local authorities and how they can regulate wireless facilities. And one of them, and I will try not to bore you with all the language, but in a nutshell, it requires that if they're going to deny a wireless facility application, it has to be in writing. It can't just be an oral denial at a hearing and that's it, you walk out and you're done. It has to be in writing, and it has to be supported by substantial evidence in a written record, meaning that they can't come up with a reason that they denied it that has nothing to do with any evidence that's in the record that doesn't support what their denial is, which is also why it has to be in writing, so that you can be informed of those reasons and decide if you want to bring a challenge to that. Make sure I'm. Then the other is what we call so the last one I talked about was the in writing and the substantial evidence clause, and then there is the effective prohibition clause, is what we call it. It says that a denial cannot have the effect, cannot prohibit or have the effect of prohibiting the provision of wireless services, and this looks beyond the reasons for the denial and whether or not they're supported by the evidence that you put forward on your application, and it looks at the practical effect that the denial has and whether it prohibits or effectively prohibits you from providing wireless service. Different courts around the country have come up with different ways to measure that, but it usually involves looking at the particular need that you have and whether there's been an adequate search for alternatives. And if there are no other alternatives to what you've proposed, then the denial of what you've proposed has been prohibited. I also want to talk about the right-of-way, because that's where we're more and more seeing wireless facilities applications. And so the ways where you can look for how governments regulate the wireless installations in the right-of-way, it can be at the state agency level, so a DOT, for example. It could be at the county or city level. It could be at all three levels, and then you would want to look at state law, because many states have law that specifically talk about these types of deployments in the right-of-way, or things that not specific to wireless, but that could extend to wireless deployment in the right-of-way, and it varies state to state, and so you'll have to look at the. Do I have a slide on? Yeah. You'll have to look at the specific state law as to who is granted the right. So there could be a state law that grants non-discriminatory access to the right-of-way for telephone corporations, is what they call it in California, or someone who is a telecommunications service provider, or it could be even more broad than that. So you need to look to who is being granted the right, and if that applies to you and to the facilities that you are seeking to install, and to what extent is the right granted? Does it cover all types of infrastructure? And does it talk about what types of fees are allowed or required? Are there any exceptions to that? And we, as many of you know, we're seeing lots of new state laws. It seems like almost every day now that are coming out governing wireless deployment in the right-of-way. And Elizabeth may be able to talk more about that and her efforts on that. But so it's ever changing, and it's still sort of up in the air to see how these play out and how they get interpreted. But those are the places where you can look to find the right to deploy. And another issue that comes up frequently is that because cities are used to governing wireless facilities in the zoning context, so they hear wireless and they think these macro towers, and when you're deploying in the right-of-way, they try to apply the same types of regulation to deployments in the right-of-way, and so it ends up being discriminatory the way that wireless installations are treated in the right-of-way as opposed to everyone else who's already been in the right-of-way. So it's a different application process that they're sometimes trying to impose, or requiring different fees or rent, requiring zoning approval, which in many local governments, their own zoning codes say that they don't apply to the right-of-way, but they still hear antenna or wireless and try to apply it to the right-of-way, or making discretionary decisions based on aesthetics, when many of these installations are less intrusive than what's already there in the right-of-way. These attempts to regulate wireless in the right-of-way could violate various provisions. It could, like I said, it could violate the city's own code. It could violate state law. It could violate federal law. And specific to federal law, back to 332, the effective prohibition clause there. Section 253 of the Telecommunications Act also has a similar effective prohibition provision for telecommunications services. Typically, you've seen a denial of a specific application challenged under Section 332, and a challenge to an actual, the language, like a facial challenge of an ordinance brought under Section 253. But both deal with actions by local governments that prohibit the provision of wireless service. Let me move forward here. Section 6409. So as wireless installations become more ubiquitous in the public right-of-way, Section 6409, which I'll explain, will come into play more and more for co-locations at existing locations or for upgrades to existing locations. Congress adopted Section 6409 in 2012, and it was a provision of, let me say this right, Title VI of the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act, which is often referred to as the Spectrum Act. And in that context, Section 6409A was specifically included to contribute to the goal of deploying wireless facilities promptly and prohibiting governments from denying what's called eligible facility requests. And those are requests to modify an existing wireless tower, the language is wireless tower, or base station that does not, quote, substantially change the physical dimensions of the tower or base station. And then in 2014, to implement that provision of the Spectrum Act, the FCC released an order that adopted rules about that and what constitutes a substantial change in the size or the physical dimensions, and what those are. A substantial change is a modification that would increase the height of the base station by 10% or 10 feet, whichever is greater. And a base station, by the way, has been defined to include structures other than towers that support or house an antenna, transceiver, or other associated equipment. So at the end of the day, what this means is that it includes utility poles, which is an important is an important thing that the FCC noted. beyond that initial point on substantial change, if it entails excavation or deployment outside of the current area, if it would defeat the concealment elements of the structure, or if it doesn't, a substantial change is if it wouldn't comply with the initial conditions of the siting approval. So when it was initially approved, if there were certain conditions that the modification or the co-location would negate, then that is a substantial change. If it results in a protrusion of greater than 6 feet from the edge of the structure, or if it involves the installation of new cabinets where there's no pre-existing cabinets, or if the ground cabinets are going to be 10% greater in height or volume than any other ground cabinets. And another important thing to note is that it does not have to be a co-location or modification. The existing facility that's already there does not have to be the same provider or the equipment of the same person that's trying to add on or modify. Did I get through all my slides here? And then I can quickly talk about pole attachments, which is another place where you see regulation. The FCC regulates pole attachments in 30 states, and that's under Section 224 of the Communications Act. And Section 224 grants non-discriminatory access at reasonable rates, terms, and conditions for cable service providers and telecommunications service providers. And in the other states that have certified to the FCC that they themselves regulate pole attachments, they have reverse preempted the FCC. And an important thing to note for all of these provisions, since I just noted that Section 224 applies to cable service providers and to telecommunication services. As many of you may know, the recent net neutrality order that came out has the effect of classifying broadband internet service as an information service and not a telecommunications service. And that's important because under Section 224, it's telecommunications services that are granted access rights to poles, and under Section 332 and Section 253, you have to be a telecommunications provider to be afforded those rights. And so there's some uncertainty as to how the FCC and the court would extend these pro-deployment, pro-competitive goals of these provisions to non-telecommunications service WISPs who are deploying similar facilities and services, but are not otherwise deemed telecommunications service. And with that, I will pass it on for hopefully more discussion on that.
Thanks. Is there a question? Did you have a question, Jay, that you wanted to ask Leslie while we're switching flashes here?
Bottom list, and you see you're on the top list. The FCC regulates the poles in your states?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. And it's the regulation, the state regulation of poles, it varies state to state. So there's no one size fits all answer to how it's regulated in those states. And as far as I know, I don't know of any states that regulate pole attachments that specifically grant access rights for information services. So, sorry.
That's right. Yeah, some states actually regulate broadband along with cable. They've extended their pole attachment rights to include to get around the Title II problem that Leslie was just talking about. So those of you expecting to see Kevin Cookler up here, I'm not Kevin Cookler, I'm Steve Coran. Kevin had, if I can remember the sequence of events with his plane last night, it was the plane arriving late from Raleigh to D.C., then it was mechanical, then it was de-icing, then it was they needed to fuel the jet, which I guess they couldn't do before. And then finally, the one thing you can't get around, the crew timed out. So at 1 o'clock in the morning in D.C., it was start over. So you'll have a chance to see him tonight. He is actually a much better expert at our firm than I am on when it comes to infrastructure issues. So he was kind enough to send me his slides, and I feel like I've been cramming for a test that you can never get higher than a C on. So I apologize in advance for being somewhat unprepared, but I figured it would be better to kind of cover this material in a average way than to not cover it at all. So please be understanding, and maybe, Chris, that kind of deflects some of the criticism from you to me.
Absolutely. It's all his fault. Yeah.
It's all my fault. So here's Kevin's name and his slide. So look for him tonight and tomorrow. He's got a couple of panels tomorrow. Thank you for reconnecting me. Right. So I'm going to talk about some things going on at the FCC now. Leslie gave you a great comprehensive review of the statutory provisions as they exist, but we're very fortunate that we have a pro-business FCC that is really trying to advance a lot of things when it comes to infrastructure and modernizing regulations on a whole host of things, whether it's things like pole attachments or utility poles, or it's co-locations or things like that. And we'll cover a few of those. But the big picture here is that we're all the beneficiaries of the FCC's desire to make its regulations 5G ready, whatever that means. And we can have a long discussion about what 5G is and what 5G isn't, and a lot of spectrum policy surrounding that, but that's a different session. So, but there's a couple things the FCC got going last year in April, which was about 3 months after Commissioner Pai became Chairman Pai. And one is a wireline, and the other is a wireless broadband infrastructure notices of proposed rulemaking. So the first one we're going to talk about is the wireless broadband NPRM, and Leslie covered some of these things that exist in the statute. And here's what the FCC is currently considering, which is, what does it mean to be deemed granted? In other words, if the local authority just sits around and doesn't do anything with your request for to build a tower or to modify a tower or something, at what point is it deemed granted? And that's a question that is in the NPRM. The issues are, what should create an irrebuttable presumption based on a lapse of state or local authority? And so there's a proposed rule there, and I think, what is it? Right now you said 90 days for a co-location and 150 for a new tower. I think they're trying to shrink that down. Do you remember exactly what the numbers were? 60.
I should have noted that under 6409, which we were talking about for eligible facilities requests, those co-locations and modifications, that does have a 60-day deadline for a local government to act on your application, and that one does have a deemed granted remedy. And the deemed granted remedy that Steve's talking about right now is not something that's currently in Section 332. Right now, your only remedy is to file a lawsuit, which itself can take years. And so that's one thing that people are advocating for, is for it to become a deemed granted remedy.
A couple other things is what constitutes a reasonable period of time, and some states, some localities have a moratorium on new construction. So I think we can go so far as to say this FCC would like to see moratoria either not happen or be only imposed in very narrow circumstances. So the record has developed there. I suspect that in the next couple of months we're going to see actual rules in this proceeding. WISPA weighed in and obviously jumped on the bandwagon with the mobile carriers, who are the ones who are really carrying the water. So on this particular proceeding, the mobile carriers are our friends because they're the ones who are driving the small cell and 5G debate. Those on the other side of these issues are the municipalities, who feel like they're being asked or told to give up control, tribes who feel like they may not have been consulted on a number of these things. So that's kind of big picture stuff. The wireless broadband notice of inquiry sought comment on the statutory terms in sections 253 and 332, which Leslie just covered. And the questions are, if you remember the underlined text in her presentation, I was paying attention, is how do we interpret prohibit or have the effect of prohibiting a request? And what constitutes unreasonable discrimination of certain types of deployment. A lot of this is being driven by a company called Mobility. Have you guys heard of Mobility? Yeah, everybody has. So they're active at the state level too, and trying to get, and have been successful in getting a lot of states to enact laws, some of which I think the one in Ohio was overturned because they attached it to like some dog catcher statute or something like that. I'm sort of like not making that up. But the point is that they've been driving a lot of this, and we're just sort of riding along. It's a lot, and a lot of it comes down to what is a small cell, because a lot of these statutes and rules, are focused on small cells. So we'll talk about that in just a second. So you'll see the date on this. That's March 1, 2018. That was 6 days ago. The FCC put out a draft of a second report and order regarding environmental and historical review. This is something this FCC has done, is unlike others, is 3 weeks before an FCC meeting, they will put out drafts of everything they're proposing to act on. Then people like us have 2 weeks to go in and try and get them to fix the language before they act on it. And then there's the 1 week quiet period, and then everybody votes. So there is an opportunity for I've talked to people in the commissioner's offices, and I think by and large people think this is probably a good policy to have, because it kind of focuses people's discussion on things that actually people are caring about instead of kind of existing in the abstract. But that's neither here nor there. So in this particular order, the FCC is going to confirm that unlicensed equipment used by WISPs and Wi-Fi routers and signal boosters are exempt from environmental historic review. How many people have had to go through an environmental historical review to get a tower built? Anybody here? Okay, okay. So this is going to make it a whole heck of a lot easier for you. Small wireless licensed facilities are also going to be exempt, and this is for geographic area licenses. The antennas are 3 cubic feet or less. You might want to ask some of the vendors down on the floor how many cubic feet their equipment is. And I can't remember how the equipment is characterized, but it's certainly the radio, but it's some of the things, but not everything that's attached to it. Forgive me, I left that in my room. No antenna structure regulation unless you have an FAA requirement where it's 200 feet or above, or you're within the cone around an airport. No environmental assessments for wireless towers in a floodplain, and the FCC would have a time frame to act on environmental assessments. Right now they don't have any. So some of this is because companies have had to spend a whole heck of a lot of money to set up like Wi-Fi networks at the Super Bowl and big events, and they have to go through this whole review process and pay thousands and thousands of dollars. And when you're trying to do these events, it kind of creates a very nice record to show that there's a lot of money spent for things like this that folks think should be eliminated, and this pro-business FCC is taking a big step to do that. Ty, did you have a question in the back? I can't hear you. Can you maybe step up to the mic or get a little closer? My ears are too old.
Is this saying that NEPA in phase 1's going away? If you're putting up a 150-foot, 200-foot tower, you don't have to worry about that? Because, as you know, the tribal costs are...
Yeah, they're getting away with a lot of the... So the answer is, I think, yes, that a lot of this stuff is going to go away. I think so, but... Again, I crammed for this test, and I didn't have a lot of time to prepare. So I think that's right. I've read the order. When you see Kevin, be sure to ask him, because he will know. But I think Section 106 is, for the most part, going to be off the table, and you won't have to go through that process. So it's a really good thing. And Commissioner Carr at the FCC is the one who's been driving. He's sort of the infrastructure commissioner. So this is kind of one step, and the next one is the orders that they adopted last year are probably going to lead to more rules too.
And then do you know anything about I think it's called the Twilight Towers?
Twilight Towers? That's coming up on the next slide,
Okay.
so,
Thank
or
you.
the one after that. I don't know anything about it. Yes, sir. Just if you guys have questions, just queue up here at the mic.
Will this preempt state and local requirements for historic review?
Yes. No. I think they will exist. Are you going to talk about that, aren't you? Yep. Elizabeth will talk about that. Good question, though. So the FCC also in this order is going to make changes to the tribal review process. And one thing is there's no upfront fees for tribal review. Tribes, way back in the day, kind of didn't charge a lot of money, and now they see big companies coming in, and they'll charge them a lot of money for tribal review. I heard one story where, well, I think I just told that one about the Super Bowl, but you're not required to engage a particular tribe as a contractor. Another way the tribes can try to take money and take time. And there is going to be a new timeline for tribal consultation. I can't remember what that is, but it's going to be shorter. What do you mean by tribal? So if you want to build a tower on tribal lands, you have to consult with a tribal authority in order to get permission and to involve them in the consultation process, so to make sure you're not on sacred grounds. And it's become a way of tribes to, I got to be nice here, but in many cases they see it as an opportunity to make a lot of money. And the FCC is going to, slow that down. Okay, environmental and historic reviews for utility pole replacements. This is some rules that came out in January of this year, and this allows you to replace a utility pole where it's almost in the same spot and not have to go through environmental and historic review. That's kind of the takeaway from this whole slide. Todd, you asked about Twilight Towers. I know the phrase. I don't really, this is, again, something I don't deal a whole lot with, but these were towers that, for some reason, there was a period of time when they didn't go through an FCC process. Can you address this a little bit? Would you mind if I pick on you to bail me out?
So I don't know if I'll get the dates correct, and maybe Elizabeth knows them. I'm not sure. So they are towers that when the rule that if it's a co-location or a modification and it doesn't have to go through the historic preservation review, when it was there was a time when it was enacted, and then like a 4 or 6 year, maybe longer period where the actual rules went into effect. So there's these towers that were approved in between that time that are sort of in a no man's land, and they either didn't go through the process or they can't prove that they did go through the process originally. And so this Twilight Towers, I believe what it will do is it will deem those no man's land towers to have gone through the review process, so that any co-location to those will not also have to go through that process.
I'll try to
speaker.
I'll try to help you out a little bit. It's
Thank you.
towers, and I forget the exact date, but towers that were built prior to some date in 2001 were called grandfather towers. You didn't have to do any of this on it, the NEPA, the phase 1. Any tower between then and now that you haven't are technically out of compliance, but they're called Twilight Towers because the FCC hasn't done any enforcement on them. They're looking at a way to potentially say that they're going to be okay. And technically, if you have carriers will not locate on a tower that you do not have the NEPA or the phase 1 done on. And all these Twilight Towers, they're saying they're not going to touch them. They'll build one right next door. Mm-hmm. By the FCC saying that it's okay, then it allows the carriers to potentially locate on them as well. So hope that helps a little.
You want to come on up here? And we have an empty seat for you, Todd. Seriously. Next show. Okay, hey, I'm done. I made it. So that means it's your turn, Elizabeth. So again, you can obviously tell that I'm not the expert on this, but when you see Kevin, if you have some follow-up questions, please ask him, because he'll be around all day tomorrow and a couple of other panels. So appreciate you guys not laughing me off the stage. Here you go.
Yeah. Well, if these guys are not the expert, I definitely am not. But I do want to ask, how many of you were in the presentation I gave yesterday on the BDAC? Okay, just a few of you. All right. My role here is essentially coming at it from sort of an opposite direction from a policy perspective, and how all of these rules and regulations are intersecting as we see the desire of the mobile carriers primarily to deploy small cells, and predominantly in municipal areas. And I'm going to talk about the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee and what we're doing. And if you want some slides on it, I can stick them in. They're very minimalistic, so I don't know how much you're going to gain. I took some notes, and I'm more than happy to take questions. But this is kind of to address these in the order that they came up in the slides. Insofar as deemed granted is concerned, this is an enormous debate at the policy level. The FCC has a lot of deemed granted recommendations and, in some cases, rules that they've allowed where something is deemed granted. The concern of the municipalities is that they don't have the resources and they don't necessarily have the motivation to get something accomplished in a short time frame. So at the last BDAC meeting, we had a big debate from the municipal perspective, and they were arguing over this 20-day recommendation, 20 days to decide whether the application is complete. Not 20 days to approve it, but 20 days to decide the application is complete. If the municipality doesn't tell you within 20 days that your application is incomplete, then it's deemed granted. This apparently created a lot of consternation on the part of the municipalities. They didn't even want that. And so I asked them, I said, why does it take you 45 days to do that? I can understand it might take you 45 days to do a historical review, but why does it take you 45 days to figure out whether you have all the pieces you need? And there's not a good answer to that question, but this is something that's very intense at the BDAC level. We did reach a compromise. The recommendation and the website, by the way, you can get all of these recommendations on the BDAC the FCC website. Search for BDAC, and you can see what the policy committee is coming out. And for those of you who don't know, the committee's role is to make recommendations for removing state and regulatory barriers to broadband deployment with the aim of closing the digital divide. Now, the digital divide, as you all know, may be within a municipality such as the city of Manhattan, the city of Manhattan, or the city of San Jose, California. San Jose is the center of Silicon Valley. They have 50,000 unserved people in that city. So there's a digital divide that exists in the city. We're more familiar with it as between urban and rural. And I think that the considerations, when you look at all of these things, they're very different when you're talking about San Jose versus, Humnoke, Arkansas. It's an extremely different analysis, and all of the questions become different. Everything from how quick does it take to process an application, whether a shot clock of 30 days is reasonable or not reasonable. So where we ended up at the BDAC in the compromise position was 29 days to deem whether the application is completed.
29?
I know, isn't that weird? 29. It's one less than 30. Yay, victory for the providers. And then another, I think it's 45 days. And if the municipality does not say, if they deem it, if they don't let you know before the 29 days that your application is incomplete, then it's deemed complete. And if they don't let you know within 45 days that your application didn't meet whatever criteria they have, then it's deemed approved. Now, this is very upsetting to the municipalities because they want local control. They want control of their rights of way. There's worry about people throwing stuff up. So when you start framing any of these things, and you can read the FCC docket if you have the desire and see all these arguments played out there, but a lot of what the providers are doing is they're moving to the states. And you saw the 20 states where you have a different set of rules than the ones that are governed by the FCC. A lot of that is being driven by providers who are going into those states and saying, this is what we want. CTIA, which is the cellular telephone folks, have passed legislation in 17 states that give them greater access to the right-of-way. And one of those key things has to do with the state franchise. So I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, but state franchise is another big trigger that's going on at that level. So basically, I think that you mentioned moratoria. The BDAC's recommendation is no moratoria. Moratoria should not be allowed unless there is a clear and imminent risk to the rights of way or public health and safety. A lot of municipalities use a moratoria on broadband deployment as a tool, either to slow the whole process down or, in the most nefarious scenario, because they have a provider who has their ear who is telling them that it's a bad idea to let you guys deploy. And that is at play a lot more often than we would like to think. And it is absolutely something that the BDAC as a whole did not think was a good idea. Again, there was a lot of pushback on the municipalities, and to the extent anyone cares, and you can, if you do, somebody can raise their hand and ask at the end, and I am more than happy to address the politics of what's going on with the municipalities and the BDAC. But it's quite interesting. The other thing is that the BDAC was trying to get at the difficult to quantify barriers to deployment, and I'm going to try to give you both sides of this debate. So if you are a provider and your goal, because you are AT&T, and your goal is small cells on every block in the city of Manhattan, what you need is the ability to go to the city of Manhattan and say, approve me to go on any pole I need to get on. You want one application, one fee for that application, and a cost-based or at least below market-based rate for the poles that you're on. And you want to make sure that you don't have to go back every single time. Right now, they have to go back every single time. If it's one pole or 100 poles, it's one application or 100 applications. They're like one application every pole I want in the city. Deal? And the municipalities say, no deal, because we can't do that. We don't have the resources, we don't have the staff, and we don't have the time. And just because 90% of those poles are perfectly peachy keen, that other 10% of the poles are in a historic area, or you have to make them look pretty. There's a whole thing in there about decorative poles. If you look at the muni regulations, recommendations out of the BDAC, there's whole sections on decorative poles and how you have to make the poles look nice and blah, blah, blah. So this is a huge flashpoint, is whether the provider, how do you strike that balance between ensuring that deployment is quick, rapid, easy, and streamlined with the real and actually legitimate need of the municipalities to ensure that the rights-of-way don't start looking like, I don't know, a Times Square billboard jungle. I mean, you need to have some local control over what's going in the rights-of-way. I will tell you that it is my understanding from people at the FCC that I've talked to that they view the municipalities as a monopoly. They have a monopoly over the rights-of-way, and there's not a whole lot of sympathy for the municipal position. I think, as the chair of the BDAC, and I am not speaking on behalf of the FCC, I am speaking on behalf of myself, I think that that's probably A, true, and B, insufficient. We are not going to get this accomplished unless we can reach a compromise that the municipalities can live with, and I think that we have to figure out how we're going to compromise with these people to make it work. The problem is they're not interested in compromising with the mobile carriers, and we're getting swept up in that drama. Yeah, exactly. She's saying the city's creating their own digital divide, no benefit of 5G, and that's 100% right. I mean, of all the cities not to be throwing down, the city of San Jose and the city of Manhattan, it's like, seriously? You're the reason that they're in. Those cities are the reason that the mobile carriers are at the FCC fighting for more spectrum. It's not Little Rock. It's not Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's Manhattan and San Jose and Dallas, Texas. And so they're fighting for all this additional spectrum so that they can deploy, so that they can serve those municipalities better. And those are the self-same municipalities who are standing up and saying, we should be able to charge $3,000 a year per pole.
And then the mayor of San Jose got mad, took his ball, and went home.
Now and now I'm happy. That's what I was thinking. I will tell that story. Do you want to hear the story about the mayor of San Jose? Let me finish a couple more other touch points, and then I will talk about the mayor of San Jose, my very near and dear friend, Sam Liccardo. So yeah, small cells, it's hilarious. So FCC, I love that. 3 cubic feet, that's awesome. You know what Sprint wants? 28 cubic feet. Now imagine that you are a city, and you are being told by the cellular carriers that they should be allowed, as of right, to put something that is the size of a small refrigerator on the poles throughout your town. That's the argument that's being raised by the providers. I mean, 3 cubic feet is reasonable. I think if that was the position, that'd be great. Right now, I think the number is sitting at 6 cubic feet in the BDAC, but it's still way too big. I mean, think about it. That's like a dorm fridge, and it's not a small cell. I would submit to all of us who are WISPs, and I think you all know this, but I am the only WISP on the BDAC, and I view my role on the BDAC to protect our interests as an industry. I don't represent WISPA, I represent Aristotle, my company, but as the only WISP, there are a lot of things that go on that are pretty subtle, that the mobile carriers are in there trying to make wireless mobile and all of this stuff. But at the end of the day, as long as the definition does not say wireless equals mobile, what the cellular carriers are advocating for will help us. Because no matter how small their equipment is, ours is smaller. No matter how lightweight or unobtrusive. I mean, they still need more than we do. They need more poles than we do. The fiber providers need more poles than we do. Their stuff is bigger than ours. It's more power consumptive than ours. It's more dramatic in every way. And so what's going on that the mobile carriers are promoting is actually pretty good for us. The problem is that what they're promoting is kind of extreme. So we can go in and be the reasonable voice and say, all right, 28 cubic feet is absurd. So when Mayor Liccardo took his ball and went home and threw a giant fit, which I'll talk about in a minute, he made very clear to say that he felt that both myself and the chair of the Municipal Working Code Group worked very well and tried to reach a compromise. That's a good position for this industry to be in, and it's a position that we're in often in the advocacy that Steve does and the other stuff on the Hill, where we're able to broker a solution among various categories, because we're not them. But we have some pretty big players who are helping us get what we need, and the mobile carriers are one of them. The only other thing is I'll say about tribal review and state preemption is it's kind of questionable whether the FCC has authority to do this, and the BDAC was specifically asked not to tell them what their legal authority is. But the one insight I have is that it's sort of like federal highway funds. The age for drinking alcohol is 21 years. The federal Constitution says that it's actually up to the states to determine how alcohol regulations. So a state could actually say it's 18, but not if they want federal highway funds. So while the federal government can't tell you it has to be 21, the federal government can withhold money so that you want it to be 21 because you need that money for your interstate freeways, right? That's what the FCC is looking at here. We will come out with model codes, we will come out with recommendations, and the FCC wants to take those recommendations to the states and say, those states that adopt these recommendations, here's your carrots that you get, and here's the sticks we won't use. Those states that don't are going to lose the carrots and get the sticks. And I think that that's sort of what they're hoping is going to come out of this. As far as the tribes are concerned, we've also been asked not to address tribal concerns. The tribes that are on the BDAC, and there's one on the BDAC itself and there's a couple in the working groups, they want us to tell them what to do. They want to hear that they're a barrier to deployment, and they want to understand how and why and how they're being left out. But we've been specifically asked not to address it because they're sovereign nations. And so the FCC can't really tell them what to do. So, in all of this, the mayor of San Jose, who is running for re-election and has 50,000 unserved people in San Jose, was very upset because there are no municipalities on the Model State Code Working Group. And the way the BDAC is divided, for those of you who didn't hear the speech yesterday, you have the broadband, you have the committee itself, which is 27 people. That's what I chair. And under that, you have 5 working groups. And in each of the 5 working groups are about 40 people each. And that's additional to the BDAC. So I'm on 2 of them, and there's another 3 that I'm not on. So one of those is the Model State Code Working Group. That group is coming out with recommendations like statewide franchise, which I'm happy to talk about too. And because it was mentioned in the slides. But the mayor didn't like it that there were no municipalities on that group. And so he started watching, I would say probably back around last September, pretty sure that the fix was in, and he started prosecuting what I would call a political agenda leading up to his re-election announcement about how the BDAC was biased against municipalities. Then, over the Christmas break, the Municipal Code Group, the chair of that committee, asked for someone to help do the next editing process, and the representative for AT&T very kindly offered to do it. And what came back at the end of 3 weeks was the language that AT&T has been lobbying for in every state legislature across the country, which the mayor of San Jose decided was proof positive that the fix was in. And so he came to the BDAC meeting in January, attended the meeting, set up his questions. He said, "Madam Chairwoman," and I said, "Yes." And he said, "Is it true that there are no municipalities on the Model State Code Working Group?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Thank you." And there were several things like that where he was clearly setting up the record. So then that night, at the end of the second day of meetings, he called me to say, "I'm resigning. Just wanted to let you know. Thanks for reaching out. Not interested in talking. And it's not you, it's me. And we're going to break up." And then the next day, they filed a minority report to the entire barriers report. And the barriers report is something you all should read, because the barriers report of the BDAC, which has been approved by the committee and is now the official recommendation, it's removing state and local barriers to broadband deployment is the working group title. That report talks about what are the barriers and how do you fix them. And throughout that report, and it has there were 9 recommendations or 10 from the meeting in November that were approved, and another 9 approved in January. Those 17 or so recommendations predominantly say that the problem is lack of resources and lack of will on the part of municipalities. It recommends study groups, it recommends changes, and the municipalities just don't like it. And if you look at the vote record, you either had abstentions or no votes on a lot of the recommendations coming out of that. And then they filed a minority report, which is not the kind of thing you write in a day. So this was a very strategically planned out thing, and now the mayor has subsequently been traveling the country and talking about how, love the chair of the BDAC, love the chair of my working group, but the FCC has rigged this thing so the municipalities can't win. He said that at the Conference of Mayors. He said that at the National League of Cities. My personal opinion is that and this is what I tell the press when they call, and incidentally, I've been called by CNN, Thomson Reuters, ComDaily about this because he is making the circuit, and the FCC keeps pointing the press to me so that I can speak on behalf of the BDAC. It's like, thanks. Like, hey, would you write an op-ed? Sure. But anyway, so which is fine. I don't mind doing it, but he's just wrong. And so what I tell them is, if you look at the count of the BDAC, yeah, it's true. There's only 2 municipalities on the BDAC itself, but there's only 1 WISP. There are 14, non-provider people on there and 12 provider people, and you can't say that it's rigged when you have all of these people who are supporting a lot of the municipal position. And I think that it's a political gambit, and I think it's a game. But what is real and is valid is that the municipalities are afraid that because the single biggest barrier to broadband deployment has been lack of access to the rights of way, excessive fees, and municipal governments delays, municipal governments that either don't have the resources or don't have the will or simply don't understand what the heck they're talking about. Undergrounding of wireless facilities. That's a thing. Who knew? That you, like, oh, sorry, that can't be on a pole, it's got to be underground. What are you talking about? This is not a cable. But they don't know, and they also don't have the resources. So from the spectrum of they don't have the resources, being the most innocent, to the other end of the spectrum, which is they view this as a money-making opportunity, and they want to be able to charge market rates, which is the position of Manhattan, of the state of New York, and of San Jose. Then you have this varying degree, but at the end of the day, the municipalities are the single biggest problem. So now you have the states trying to preempt them. You have CTIA and AT&T going throughout the country, and they've gotten state franchise passed in 17 states, most recently in Florida. I recommend you to the Florida statute that just passed this year. That statute is a model for a lot of what the BDAC model code is recommending. The BDAC model code does call for state franchise. We do not call for a usurpation of local control over the rights of way, but we do say that you should be able to go into one governing body and say, I would like a franchise. It's time. I would like a franchise, and I'd like the right to deploy anywhere in the state, and you should be able to get that. It's fine. I talked last, and you just talked a lot, so. Hey, you can pull me off anytime. I'm happy to stop now. I've already given this speech once. No, just kidding. But the state franchise lets you deploy anywhere, and then the municipalities can figure out how. And those are the recommendations out of the municipal group. There is a docket. You can read the minority report of the municipalities if you want to understand where they're coming from. It's in the docket. The docket is, I'll send it to Chris and he can put it in the slides. And also the website is fcc.gov, and you can search for BDAC, and it has everything. It has all of the reports. I do recommend you to them. There is an ad hoc group of rates and fees that I created. The debate right now in that group is what should be charged for the rights of way. What can the municipalities charge? What should the municipalities charge? Not dollar figures, but is that market-based or cost-based? And it's a pretty involved deal, and I would be happy to talk to anybody either now or later or whenever about any of this. Just stop me in the hall or whatnot, because it's very complicated and it's very politically charged. And right now, but one last thing I'll say, what is coming out of it is that because the BDAC is moving slower than others, the state of Kansas has already taken the draft model state code and is enacting some of the BDAC recommendations in Kansas. So we're hoping that if nothing else, that'll happen, because this is a pretty august body. I mean, every kind of walks of life is there. The best thing, if you want to watch the video, watch the last meeting, the first day, fast forward to the argument between Google and AT&T. It lasts for about 30 minutes, and it is hilarious. The providers don't even really like each other. The big debate, the big arguments, CTIA and Comcast, Google and AT&T, and they just argue across the table at each other, and it's pretty interesting. So the idea that the providers have the fix-in is absurd. They don't even like each other. Okay, and with that, I'm going to pass it back to the moderator.
So we can sneak in a couple of questions if anybody has any right now. Otherwise, I'm going to ask one real quick.
Thanks, Chris. I'd like just
Too quick, and then we get too quick, and then we better
I'll
get
try
out
to
of here.
make this quick. Thank you so much. I'm from a rural area where the municipality is the county, not the city.
Yeah.
We're not dealing with right-of-way. We're dealing with all that other space
Yeah.
out there. And I'm wondering, from a regulatory standpoint, what's happening out on the Hill that's going to help those of us who aren't necessarily dealing with the right-of-way?
Okay, well, the BDAC recommendation is that we use the word authority, and the authority is whoever controls the area that you're trying to deploy in. So that would include your county government, and so everything that's in those recommendations would apply to your county government.
So mine is essentially on that. Are we also talking about federal lands, BML?
Federal, yes, there is a working group on federal siting, and that report was approved. There were 3 reports that were approved in final form: federal siting, regulatory barriers, and access to competitive infrastructure. So those 3 reports are final, and those are the recommendations of the BDAC. There is I think there's about 7 or 10 recommendations that came out of federal siting that have to do with streamlining siting on federal properties.
In that, the issue of not necessarily a moratorium, but a net zero build on towers on land, is that addressed at all?
The net zero build is considered a moratorium.
It is, okay. Thank you.
What was your question?